Today we'll spend the hour with Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was in New York recently to honor the late Columbia University professor Edward Said, who died this fall after a battle with leukemia for over a decade. They had spent time several years ago at the very theater that Noam Chomsky spoke at, delivering address together on the Middle East. This speech was dedicated to Professor Edward Said. In the speech, Chomsky strongly criticized the Bush administration's war against Iraq and talked about the power investors have over world affairs, the media's capitulation to them, and much more. Noam Chomsky's latest book is called Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance. Before that, he wrote the best-selling book 911. This is Noam Chomsky at Columbia University.
First remark has to do with the title. The title that was announced was After the War, which is a good topic. We should be concerned with what's coming ahead. But any title like that, especially in the United States, requires a kind of a word of caution. There is a trap which is deeply rooted in the intellectual culture, and we have to avoid it. The trap is a doctrine that I've sometimes called the doctrine of change of course. It's a doctrine that's invoked every 2 or 3 years in the United States. The content of the doctrine is, yes, in the past we did some wrong things because of our innocence or out of inadvertence, but now that's all over, so we can, let's not waste any more time on this boring, stale stuff, which incidentally we suppressed and denied while it was happening, but must now be effaced from history as we march forward to a glorious future. And if you look, it is literally every 2 or 3 years that the doctrine is invoked. There's a qualification. We're permitted, in fact required, to recall with great horror the misdeeds of official enemies, and we're also required to admire with awe our own magnificent achievements in the past, in both categories, relying in no small measure on self-serving reconstructions, which quickly collapse if you follow the path of paying attention to the facts. But fortunately, that dangerous course is excluded by the convenient doctrine of change of course, which blocks any such heresies. The doctrine is entirely understandable on the part of those who are engaged in criminal enterprises, which means just about any power system, any system of concentrated power, past and present, and of course it includes its acolytes. One of the major commitments of respected intellectuals right throughout history is to be the acolytes of systems of power. Since intellectuals write history, it doesn't look like that, but you have to be cautious about what people write about themselves. If you look carefully, you'll find that. The doctrine is dishonest, cowardly, but has advantages. It does protect us from the danger of understanding what's happening before our eyes, and therefore inducing the kind of conformism that is useful to systems of power and domination. So it has its advantages. In any event, the word after in the title is appropriate, but with some qualifications that should be kept in mind. And what has happened before, if we escape the domination of the doctrine, what has happened before can be expected to persist for elementary reasons. Policies and actions are rooted in institutions. There's some variation, but limited. The institutions are stable. Therefore, it's only reasonable to expect the policies and actions to persist, adapted to circumstances. And if you want to understand anything about the world that is to come and have any influence on the way it evolves, it's more than useful to keep this in mind. Well, let's go to after the war. We might as well, adopting the doctrine of change of course, we might as well start with today. So today, our leader is in London. The mayor of London greeted him by declaring that George Bush is the greatest threat to life on the planet that we have most probably ever seen. As I walked in, I was told by someone that they just heard over the radio that someone else, I forget who, announced that he's the most unwelcome visitor to England since William the Conqueror. These sentiments are described here as rather somehow met with some surprise, but that reflects again the useful category, the useful quality of forgetting the recent past. Similar sentiments have been very widely expressed since September 2002, to some extent before, but particularly since then. Within weeks after September 2002, a crucial moment in world affairs, within weeks, even the mainstream U.S. press was compelled to report that the world now regards George Bush as a greater threat to peace than Saddam Hussein. And that, in fact, is an understatement, because much as Saddam Hussein was hated and reviled, he was not regarded as a threat, even by the countries that he had attacked, Iran and Kuwait, both of which understood perfectly well that after a decade of sanctions that had devastated the society, and after having been effectively disarmed, however awful Saddam Hussein was, he wasn't going to threaten anybody. It was, in fact, the weakest country in the region. One of the reasons why it was attacked, it met the primary condition for a target of attack, namely totally defenseless and known to be. So in fact, they had joined the other states in the region in trying to integrate Iraq back into the region for several years over strong U.S. objections. So the statement, while correct, is understated. These kinds of reactions, those you hear today and you've been hearing for the past year, if you pay attention, are, as far as I'm aware, entirely without precedent. I can't remember anything like them. And no matter how one decides to evaluate the sentiments that are expressed, one thing is clear: no sane person should ignore them. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a European Union poll which aroused some interest here. The poll was asking Europeans what they thought was the greatest threat to world peace. And it turned out that the United States was ranked right next to North Korea and Iraq, same percentage. Well, that was felt to be a surprise, but it shouldn't have been a surprise, because that's what polls have been showing for a year, over a year. Growing concern and fear that the United States is out of control under the present leadership and is a tremendous threat to peace. Actually, the commentary on the poll focused on something else, namely the U.S., North Korea, and Iran were ranked right below Israel, which was ranked as the greatest threat to peace. But my strong suspicion is that that's because the questions in the poll were wrongly asked. You have to be really careful reading polls. Israel in itself is not a threat, much of a threat at all. But U.S. support for Israel is an enormous threat to world peace. And I presume that that's what people were answering, however the question was phrased. And if that's correct, then the major threats perceived to world peace in Europe are U.S. support for Israel, and which is the regional superpower, and U.S. actions elsewhere in the world. Well, if that's the right interpretation, then the polls are reflecting an understanding of phenomena that are real and important and widely understood. They were just pointed out in an important book that's about to appear by Dilip Hero. He's one of the most astute and knowledgeable commentator historians dealing with the contemporary Middle East and the international framework in which its problems arise. What he says is about after the war, the book's about the Iraq War and its consequences. He says what has actually happened in Iraq is something deadlier than the worst scenarios sketched by the so-called liberal pessimists. The invasion of Iraq has led to an alliance of Arab nationalism with Islamic militancy, steering both of them towards an amalgam, which is very ominous for the region and, in fact, for the world. Again, today's newspapers give you other examples of that. And another contributing factor to this extremely dangerous amalgam is U.S. support for Israel's continued rejection of a long-standing international consensus on a political settlement for the Israel-Palestine issue, and its ongoing actions to undermine any possibility that a political settlement can be reached, always, crucially, with decisive U.S. support. Otherwise, those actions are impossible. For 30 years now, the U.S. has been unilaterally, and that's worth stressing, unilaterally blocking the possibility of a political settlement and providing the decisive diplomatic, economic, and military means that permit the actions that step by step make any such settlement impossible. That's dramatically true right now. It's all consistently suppressed in the doctrinal system, and now, of course, it's to be, if even mentioned, eliminated from history by the usual means, the convenient doctrine of change of course. This has been decisive for 30 years, and it's going on, and we should pay attention to it if we care about the future. Today's news, again, gives further reasons. With regard to Iraq, the predictions before the war by intelligence agencies and independent analysts were pretty uniform. It was predicted that the invasion of Iraq would increase the threat of terror, would yield the amalgam that Dilip Hero is talking about. It would increase the threat of terror and of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The logic of that is straightforward. If you announce to people, I'm going to come and attack you at will without any pretext, they don't say, thank you, here's my neck, cut it. What they do is respond in some fashion. And no one can respond to the United States in military force. The U.S. spends about as much by now as the rest of the world combined, and is far more technologically advanced. So people turn to the weapons available to them. And the weak do have weapons available to them. Two, in fact, terror and weapons of mass destruction, which are now not that hard to construct, and sooner or later will be united. For example, they might be united in a small nuclear weapon sneaked into a New York hotel room. Not at all out of the question. And by inciting terror and inciting proliferation as a deterrent or for revenge, those probabilities are being increased. Well, those were the predictions before the Iraq War, and they've been verified, not surprisingly, since the war. It has apparently, according to specialists on the various countries involved, stimulated proliferation, not surprisingly, and it has certainly stimulated terror. The same intelligence agencies and independent analysts are reporting a sharp spike in recruitment for Al-Qaeda-style organizations, and if you pay attention, you observe an increase of horrendous terrorist acts all over the world, exactly as predicted. Well, the administration was certainly aware of this. I mean, they can figure it out themselves even without reading the reports of their own intelligence agencies. And they don't desire that outcome, but they don't care that much. It just has a low priority ranked alongside of other concerns. And those other concerns are not insignificant. Some of them are domestic. These are not conservatives. They are radical, reactionary statists who are dedicated to unraveling the progressive achievements, legislation, and actions of the past century. And to do that, they have a very narrow hold on political power. They must maintain it in order to carry out that program. You see it day by day in the legislations produced and the actions undertaken. And they have an international program, which has been announced, dominating the world by force permanently, preventing any challenge, and in particular controlling the very crucial energy resources of the world, mostly in the Middle East, secondarily in Central Asia and a few other places. Those are serious goals, and they're worth undertaking from the perspective of the policy managers, even if it does increase the threat of destruction, in fact, maybe destruction of the species, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terror, of which the population of the United States will also be subject sooner or later as before.
Noam Chomsky, speaking at Columbia University. We'll come back to this speech, and if you'd like to get a copy of it, video or audio, you can call 1-800-881-2359, 1-800-881-2359. Back with Noam Chomsky in a minute. Jacob's Ladder, Chumbawamba, here on Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we return to the speech of Professor Noam Chomsky.
How do Iraqis feel about all this? Well, you know, that's obviously critically important and much harder to determine. It's harder to determine the attitudes and opinions of people who are under military occupation. But it's not impossible. There's a series of U.S.-run polls taking place, and they're informative. So one recent poll actually had a front-page story in the New York Times with a headline saying that Iraqis are pleased to be rid of Saddam Hussein. Well, we didn't need a poll to tell us that. And presumably, although the question wasn't asked, they are happy to be relieved of the murderous U.S. sanctions, which had killed hundreds of thousands of people, devastated the society, and reduced it to total ruin. That question wasn't asked because you're not allowed to mention it. You're not allowed to mention that this took place. We don't consider our own massive crimes. The doctrine of change, of course, is so extreme that you don't even mention them while they're going on, let alone in the past. So that question wasn't asked, that almost predictable answer wasn't mentioned. Also unmentioned is the fact that the murderous sanctions are a large part of the reason why Iraqis were unable to send Saddam Hussein to the same fate that greeted other comparable monsters and tyrants and torturers who were also supported by the people who are now in office in Washington, just as they supported Saddam Hussein right through his worst atrocities and long after the war with Iran. And there's quite a rogues gallery. Ceaușescu of Romania, for example, was quite comparable to Saddam, supported by the Reagan and Bush administrations right to the last minute, overthrown from within. And the same is true of a long list. Marcos Duvalier, Mobutu, Suharto, long list, all strongly supported as long as they could maintain power, overthrown from within, ranking easily many of them with Saddam Hussein in brutality and terror. But if you destroy a society and you compel the society to rely on the tyrant just for survival, things like that aren't going to happen. This has been understood for a long time. Again, those are some of the things you just don't mention, just like you don't mention the effects of the sanctions. Well, there was a more interesting aspect of the poll than the headline. If you read down further in the column, there were other results given. One of the questions asked in the same poll was people were asked for how they evaluated foreign leaders, a favorability ranking. Do you have a favorable opinion of, X, Y, and Z? Well, the one who ranked highest by far, was French President Jacques Chirac, who was the symbol, the international symbol of opposition to the invasion. Well below him, you found Bush, and even below him, the rather pathetic Blair, trailing behind. That was reported without comment, although evidently the New York Times reporter had bothered him a little, and he came back to it a couple of weeks later and mentioned it in another context and had a comment on it. He gave the figures, and his comment was, "Go figure." Well, I'm not sure exactly how to interpret that, but I presume what he meant is crazy Arabs, go figure. Here we liberate them, and they're not thanking us for liberating them. Go figure. What can it possibly mean if they regard Jacques Chirac as give him the most highest favorable ranking of any foreign leader? Well, figure Columbia students might be able to figure out a different interpretation. But anyway, for the Times, it was go figure. Turn to another poll where this question was asked, a recent one. How do you regard the coalition forces? Are they an occupying force or a liberating force? By 5-1, they were called an occupying force. Should the coalition forces leave? By 5-3, Iraqis wanted them to leave. That's a remarkable figure, because about 95% of the population also reports that the security situation is much worse than it was before the invasion, and the only thing that's keeping any kind of a lid on it is the occupying forces. But nevertheless, by a very substantial majority, they want them to leave. Well, what does that mean? Again, you can figure it out. Other polls ask people, why did the United States invade Iraq? Well, here it's in the United States, there's some answers, straight answers. So the official reason, widely repeated, as long as you could hang on to it, was that we invaded Iraq because of their weapons of mass destruction and their links to terror, which is just such a threat to us that we can't let it continue. And there was a massive government media propaganda campaign about this starting in September 2002 when the invasion was effectively announced. And it did drive a large part of the U.S. population completely off the international spectrum. The United States was the only country where a large part of the population was genuinely afraid of Saddam Hussein because of his weapons of mass destruction and his links to terror. And it turns out that the people who had those attitudes are strongly correlated with support for the war, which is not in the least surprising. I mean, if I believed those things, I'd support the war too. I mean, if you believe that here's a murderous tyrant accumulating weapons of mass destruction, responsible for 9/11, linked to Al-Qaeda, planning new terror, we've got to stop him in time. as a rational decision to invade Iraq. Of course, there's not it was never, there never was any reason to believe that there was a particle of truth to that. As I say, the U.S. was alone in having any detectable part of the population hold those opinions, even in places like Iran and Kuwait. Well, the lying about that continues until the present. It doesn't matter that it was all debunked. So George Bush, in his radio addresses just a couple of weeks ago, he continues to repeat that the U.S., I'm quoting him, saved the world from a tyrant who was developing weapons of mass destruction and cultivating ties to terror. Well, you know, nobody believes that, including his speechwriters. But they know it, but they know something else. They know that if you keep repeating a lie long and loud enough and nobody takes you account for it, it'll become truth. There are plenty of precedents for that, not pretty ones to think about, but they're there, and you know them, so I won't go on with them. But it helps account for the reactions that you hear around the world. The collapse of the official stories about weapons of mass destruction and terror, they did have consequences, in fact, ominous consequences. The most significant consequence of the collapse of the story about weapons of mass destruction was that it changed the official doctrine. All of this is taking place in the context of the national security strategy that was announced in September 2002. And that strategy was based on the principle that if a country has weapons of mass destruction, the United States is entitled to attack it in anticipatory self-defense. What's called in the press and some commentary preemptive war, but that's a total fabrication, has nothing to do with preemptive war. It's just a euphemism for direct aggression. As Arthur Schlesinger pointed out, preemption means something and nothing like that. But that was the doctrine, whatever you think about it. The doctrine's been changed with the discovery that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The doctrine has been changed so that now the United States has the right and authority, sovereign right, to attack any country that has the intent and ability to develop weapons of mass destruction. Okay, that's a significant change. That lowers the bars on aggression very significantly. In fact, it makes it universal. Every country has the ability to develop weapons of mass destruction. Any country with a high school chemistry and biology lab has that capacity. And intent is in the eye of the beholder. You know, you don't need any evidence for it. So that what that's saying, in effect, is everybody's liable to attack. We have the sovereign right to attack anyone we want. That's a significant change in the doctrine. And even if it's not reported here, it's noticed by the potential victims, and the potential victims are now generalized essentially universally. Another consequence of the collapse of the official reasons is that there's a new, doctrine about why we went to war. It was a reflection of what the press calls our yearning for democracy. It's a term that became prominent in the Reagan years. We have a yearning for democracy. And it's, so we invaded Iraq in order to establish a democracy there because of our yearning for democracy, and in fact did democratize the whole Middle East and so on. If you read the commentary on this, you know, the press, journals, and so on, I think you'll discover that this assumption is close to universal. Even the critics, the strongest critics, say, yes, invaded to create democracy, but, you know, premature, can't do it, circumstances aren't right, one criticism or another. And sometimes the repetition of this assumption reaches the level of really rapturous acclaim, the kind you may remember from reading the North Korean press, if you look at it. David Ignatius, the highly respected leading commentator in the Washington Globe, recently, just a couple of weeks ago, described the invasion of Iraq as the most idealistic war fought in modern times, fought solely to bring democracy to Iraq and the region. And, you know, how can you be more noble than that? Now, he was particularly impressed with Paul Wolfowitz, the grand visionary of the yearning for democracy, who he describes as a genuine intellectual whose heart bleeds for the oppressed in the Muslim world and who dreams of liberating it. So presumably that explains his career, like his very strong support for Suharto in Indonesia, one of the worst mass murderers and killers and aggressors and torturers. Wolfowitz was ambassador to Indonesia, you know, very full of support for his friend Suharto, and that goes right up till 1997, you know, a couple of months before Suharto was overthrown by an internal revolution. However, it's only fair to say that Wolfowitz's support for democracy and yearning, you know, his heart bleeding for the tortured victims is ecumenical. It's not limited to Muslims. So he had the same attitude toward, he was the high official in the State Department under Reagan concerned with Asian affairs, and that support extended to the brutal, vicious dictator Chun of South Korea, who, despite the support of the Reagan administration to the very end, was overthrown by a mass popular movement in 1987. It extends to Marcos in the Philippines. The Reagan administration was full of what they called love for Marcos and his love of democracy, and that continued until he was overthrown to the end. All of this is on Wolfowitz's watch, and it continues. I won't go on with it, but all of this is irrelevant because of the convenient doctrine of change of course. So yes, he's a grand visionary who loves democracy and whose heart bleeds for the victims of oppression. And if there's a record that shows precisely the opposite, it's just that boring old stuff which we forget about, because that's, now we're going on to the future. Well, I don't know how far back the doctrine of change of course extends, but if it extends a few months, then there's some other things that you might mention. So, for example, Wolfowitz dramatically illustrated his love of democracy earlier this year when he berated the Turkish military for failing to intervene to prevent the elected government from keeping to the position of 95% of the population. Okay, about 95% of the population was opposed to participation in the U.S. war in Iraq, and surprisingly, the elected government went along with them, which caused absolute fury in the United States. Powell instantly announced that they were going to be harshly punished for this, cutting back aid and so on. That they were denounced all over the press. Former ambassador Morton Abramowitz wrote an article saying this proves that the government lacks democratic credentials because it's not listening to orders from Crawford and Washington. It's following 95% of the population. But Wolfowitz went even beyond denouncing the military for not intervening and demanding that they apologize to the United States for this and recognize that their duty is, as he put it, to help the United States. Now that's real commitment to democracy. And that's a couple of months ago. In extenuation of Wolfowitz, one might say that this was in the midst of a display of hatred and contempt for democracy of a sort that I've never seen in the past. It was so obvious you couldn't ignore it, all connected with this same insistence of a few governments on keeping to the overwhelming position of their population, bitterly condemned for this across the spectrum. The ones that were hailed were the ones that disregarded even larger percentages of their population. They were the bold New Europe, the wave of the future. These great Churchillian figures like Berlusconi, for example. I've never seen anything like that. And what's astonishing and revealing to us and important for the future is that this display of total hatred for democracy went side by side with a chorus of self-adulation for our yearning, about our yearning for democracy. I mean, to be able to carry that off is a very impressive achievement, not only of the media, but of educated intellectuals generally. I think it'd be hard to mimic that in a totalitarian state. You might want to think about it and what it means.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky speaking at Miller Theater at Columbia University in November. We're going to come back to the speech. If you want to get a copy of it, you can call 1-800-881-2359. If you'd like to get a videotape of this speech, 1-800-881-2359. Back with Noam Chomsky in a minute. Bomb the World, Michael Franti, here on Democracy Now! As we return to Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, speaking at Columbia University this past November.
Well, going back to why did the United States invade Iraq, there's a story here, changing story, but always a story. And Iraqis have some opinions about it, too. A few days after the Washington Post article with the ode to our awesome magnificence, a few days later, they actually published a poll in which Iraqis were asked, among other things, why did the United States invade Iraq? And there were some that agreed that the U.S. invaded Iraq to establish democracy, 1%. So Wolfowitz and the American intellectual community are not totally without support in Iraq. I think about 4%, if I remember, thought it was to help Iraqis. Then come the obvious reasons, which, go figure type reasons. Well, again, that must be the crazy Arabs. They don't understand us. They're kind of like the Europeans, as other distinguished commentators have pointed out. For 200 years, Europe has failed to understand what makes the United States tick. They think we have crass motives and so on. They don't know that we're driven by indescribable idealism. It's Max Boot, Robert Kagan, others, who are apparently unaware that they're simply plagiarizing the most disgraceful episodes of European imperialism, where every horrendous act in England and France and Germany and everywhere else was accompanied by exactly the same rhetoric, I mean, almost to the word sometimes. Anyhow, they don't understand it. The Iraqis, maybe their failure to comprehend what we're doing follows from the fact that they haven't yet mastered the doctrine of change of course. So they don't know that they somehow think that everything we've done in the past might have some bearing on what's happening now. And maybe they're even aware that what's held here, there's something here you read about called the neo-Reaganite, pursuing the hopes that Bush will pursue what's called the neo-Reaganite course of democracy enhancement. That was the leading theme of the Reagan administration, yearning for democracy and democracy enhancement. And something did happen. And in fact, if you look at the polls I just quoted, you see a sophisticated comprehension of it. So 1% of the Iraqi population says the U.S. invaded to establish democracy, but about half the population says the U.S. will establish a democratic form of government. Okay, and they add, the U.S. will maintain pressure and influence on that democratic form of government. And that's correct. The United States, like every other conquering power, I mean, even Stalin, wants to establish something that will be called a democratic form of government, but will make sure that it operates within fixed limits. So Stalin was full of the most impressive rhetoric about the need for democracy, even established people's democracies, you know, you had votes, all sorts of things. And that's conventional. And in fact, the more you know, honest scholars and even participants in the so-called democracy enhancement programs recognize that the U.S. was willing to establish democracy, or at least tolerate it, but only, I'm quoting, top-down forms of democracy in which traditional elites linked to the United States retain power, whatever the democratic forms. Actually, that holds internally to the United States as well. But that conception of democracy is not only permitted, but in fact preferred, if only for public relations reasons. And evidently, Iraqis have some insight into this fact, judging by poll figures like this, assuming that they're not just crazy Arabs and you can't explain anything. But if you try to give an explanation, it doesn't seem hard to give one. And it is, after all, their own experience. I mean, the British and who created Iraq for their own interests, when they ran that part of the world, they did pretty much the same thing. You go back to the British Colonial Office records in the First World War, they discussed how they should set up in the region that they're running what they called Arab facades. That is, weak, pliable governments. If they can look democratic, that's fine, as long as the British effectively rule behind one or another constitutional fiction, like formal democracy. As long as that can be done, then the Arab facades are fine. Collaborators should run the governments, both the political and the military side, and that's incidentally the way empires usually run. They run with collaborators. So, like when even the worst killers and tyrants, say the Nazis in occupied Europe, they didn't administer the countries. France was administered by the French. The security forces were French. Same throughout the region. Stalin, the Russians in Eastern Europe rarely had to intervene. The countries were controlled by domestic collaborators, governments, security forces, and so on. And that's typical of the history of empire. In fact, what's amazing about the Iraqi occupation, surprises me at least, is that the occupiers have been so incompetent and arrogant and ignorant that they haven't been able to carry off what should have been one of the easiest military occupations in history, and certainly has been carried out by plenty of others. Characteristically, military occupations succeed under much more difficult conditions. Here, there's no external, it's not like Nazi Germany, you know, where there was external support for resistance and the country was under attack. Here, no attack, you know, no external support for resistance. They did end the sanctions, you know, tremendous benefit. They got rid of a tyrant. How can you fail? You know, somehow it's failing. That's interesting to see why. The words I just used, arrogance, incompetence, and ignorance, are in fact the words of a high official of one of the major NGOs who's had experience, I can't mention his name, who's had experience all over the most worst parts of the world, and said after a couple of months in Baghdad that he'd never seen anything like it. Well, anyway, that's where it is. The Bush administration has announced new plans the last couple of days that are supposed to relieve this unimaginable failure, and they've been very highly praised. You look at the plans, incidentally, among I'll come back to that in a second, but among the plans they've already implemented are, as you know, imposing an extremely harsh neoliberal economic program, which effectively hands the entire economy over to foreign investors and banks and local collaborators, it's certain that no sovereign country would ever accept such a regime. And it has been pointed out, you're starting to get commentary in law journals and a few other places, that this is all totally illegal. It's in radical violation of the Geneva Conventions on Occupation. And furthermore, that they've been pointed out that any independent Iraqi government is very likely to just renounce all of these agreements because they're imposed by force, illegally, they have no status, and that would leave the U.S. taxpayer with a huge bill to pay for all the actions that have been undertaken under the rubric of these illegal measures. Well, those critical comments are making an assumption that the U.S. is someday going to permit an independent Iraqi government to exist. And where's that assumption come from? Can you find a basis for that in the history of the control of the backyard, Caribbean, Central America for a century, or anywhere else for that matter? I think you have a hard time finding it. But if you adopt the doctrine of change of course, you don't have to worry about ugly little questions like that. When the new plans were announced a few days ago, as I said, highly praised, there's a small aspects of them which receive less attention. One is that they include a status of forces agreement of a familiar kind, which guarantees the right of the U.S. military to remain without change in Iraq under its own decisions and to establish military bases, which are to be permanent military bases, on the analogy, and this is described as of Afghanistan and Kosovo. So the countries can go to wreck and ruin, nobody cares about that, but the U.S. retains the military bases. In Iraq, it's particularly important, not like much more so than Afghanistan and Kosovo, although those are related, because having a major military base at the heart of the oil-producing regions is a very significant achievement. The U.S. has not, the whole U.S. military basing system for years around the world has been oriented toward the Middle East, the main energy-producing region, but the U.S. hasn't had any stable bases there. Up till a couple of years ago, the nearest one was in the British island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, from which the inhabitants were expelled, and the British courts ordered the government to allow them to return, but then there's that thing called the special relationship that people talk about. Under the special relationship, if the British courts order the government to allow the inhabitants to return, and the partner says, get lost, they get lost. So the bases remain and the inhabitants don't return. One small aspect of the special relationship, many others like it. But now the bases are coming closer. So Afghanistan is close by. Kosovo is much closer to the oil-producing regions than earlier ones. The bases in Central Asia, where the U.S. is now supporting another rogues gallery comparable to the first term of the same people, Karimov and others belong in the same category. The bases there are, again, part of the encircling of the major Middle East region and also placing U.S. corporations and interests in a effective position for control of Central Asian resources, which are not at the level of Middle East, but are not insignificant. A base right in the middle is extremely important, and that's very crucial for world control. That has been understood for years. It's particularly important to control the Middle East oil reserves, roughly expected to be about 2/3 of energy reserves in the coming years, because that provides what George Kennan once called veto power over the actions of others in the world. And the others in the world who are of most concern are the other major economic centers in what has been a tripolar economic world for a quarter of a century, Europe and Northeast Asia, which is the most dynamic economic region of the world. There has always been a concern with Europe, it goes back half a century, that they might move on an independent course. And that's a deep concern of U.S. policymakers. Control of energy and also of sea lanes is one way to forestall such efforts. It's not insignificant. Well, it's important to bear in mind, finally, that the astonishing reaction, global reaction and domestic reaction to the Bush administration's actions and plans, it's not just a matter of the invasion of Iraq. I mean, it's maybe the dramatic one, but that's against the background. If the invasion had taken place without the background, you wouldn't get this reaction. It's widely understood that the invasion of Iraq was what's sometimes called an exemplary action. That is an action undertaken to demonstrate to the world that the administration was very serious about the doctrine that had just been announced. The invasion of Iraq was announced about the same time as the national security strategy, and the doctrine did declare that the U.S. has the right of aggression at will, without pretext, without international authorization. It was announced quite brazenly. It's not entirely new by any means, but the brazenness of the proclamation and the instant implementation made it clear that this is a significant turning point. Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, immediately, a couple of weeks later, had a major article describing what it called the new imperial grand strategy of the Bush administration, which it went on to describe in muted terms as a great danger to the United States and the world, a very widely held view. The exemplary action announced at once, the invasion of Iraq, was combined with several others, which are equally and maybe even more ominous. Right after, a couple of weeks after the national security strategy was announced and the invasion was announced, the Space Command, which is in charge of militarization of space, announced that it was changing. It presented its plans for the next couple of years, and it said we're shifting the mission from control of space, which was the Clinton doctrine, to ownership of space. So we're moving from control to ownership. Well, that's in accord with the national security strategy. No potential challenge to U.S. authority will ever be tolerated, and force will be used to prevent it. Well, space is a new frontier. So we're not just going to control it, we're going to own it. No one's going to get near it. And they spell out what that means. That means putting up space platforms which can be used for offensive military weapons, nuclear and non-nuclear, highly lethal weapons, which can strike anywhere on Earth instantaneously with no warning. The world is to be covered with hypersonic drones, which are going to give instant information back to some command post in the Colorado mountains or whatever about somebody crossing the street in Istanbul or whatever they happen to be looking at. In principle, that means that the entire world is at mercy of the Pentagon. Instantaneous attack with highly destructive weapons, no warning. This is backed up by a first strike policy, which again is not new. Clinton had it too, but it's much more clearly enunciated. This reduces the need for forward bases, which are often a pain in the neck because people don't like them, since you have a forward base, namely the space which you own, and it does literally put the whole world at the mercy of the Pentagon and the White House. There are other futuristic programs which have also been announced. If you take a look at the DARPA, it's a good place to look. The Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Pentagon are planning some pretty astonishing things described as potential military measures, But it's worth remembering that there's something that the Pentagon knows that doesn't really seem to penetrate much into economics departments, and that is that the economy as a whole relies very heavily on a dynamic state sector, which socializes cost and risk, privatizes profit. Not only if for a long time it's been under a military cover, now it's moving to other covers as the cutting edge of the economy becomes biology-based rather than electronics-based. You see a shift in federal funding reflecting that understanding. And the DARPA programs are in things like neuroengineering and other areas which are expected to be part of the cutting edge of the economy. So sooner or later, after the public pays the costs, if anything comes out, you hand it over to private corporations. It's known as free enterprise officially. All of this increases the threats to survival, which is not unusual. If you take a look at history, including recent history, it's simply replete with illustrations of how leaders have been willing to face destruction, a significant risk of destruction, in order to achieve narrow interests, to advance narrow interests of power and domination and enrichment, in this case, shaping the powerful state to serve their interests and cut off the parts that serve the interests of the public. There are differences today. For one thing, the administration is at an extreme reactionary end of a rather narrow planning spectrum, which is the reason for the enormous reaction. And of course, the scale is different. The stakes are much higher than they've been in the past. It's not so clear that there's much time left to prevent literal destruction of the species or something rather close to it. There may not be much time left to reverse this course. And we know, if we're honest, that we can do it, but it's going to require will and dedication. It's not going to happen by itself.
Noam Chomsky, speaking at Miller Theater, Columbia University on November 20th, 2003, honoring the late Professor